Okay, hi Emiliano, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to give one of these seminars because I'm really amazed by the philosophy and finance network and all the projects behind it. So I consider really a privilege to have the opportunity to present a part of my work. So I'm going to start right away because I really have a ton of things to say. As you can imagine from the title, I'm going to speak about transactions. And the ontology of transactions is one of the main topics of my dissertation, which is about ontology of finance. And when I was preparing this presentation, I realized that probably it was a good idea to do an introduction to applied ontology and to the practical applications of an ontology of finance before jumping into the discussion of the ontological problems about transaction. So this is the plan for today. First of all, I would like to give you a bit of context about applied ontology because that helps to better understand why I'm trying to provide a characterization of transactions. I also think that to say more about the framework I'm working in can help to foster future collaborations. And after that, I will explain why we need an ontology of finance, and I will consider two recent attempts to provide such an ontology. And this will give me the opportunity to say something about, very briefly, about realism and conceptualism in applied ontology, and what are the challenges of building a realism-based ontology of finance. And finally, I will consider transactions. I will consider three different financial transactions, three different examples, and as we will see, there are at least two main aspects to consider about transactions. On one hand, there are the actions that we actually perform during a transaction. And so part of the problem is to understand the nature of these actions. On the other hand, it's also important to investigate the nature of the things we are acquiring during a transaction. So first of all, what is an ontology? People who had the chance to study philosophy know that what an ontology is in philosophy. But in this section, I will briefly say something about what an ontology is in computer and information science. So in philosophy, with the term ontology, we mean the study of what there is in the world. So the study of the kinds and structures of objects, events, and properties. And this study can concern any area of reality. Traditionally, historically, philosophers have been focused mostly on the ontology of the natural world, but recently many philosophers have started studying social ontology, which is the study of what there is in the social world. In the field of information and computer science, the term ontology has a bit more, a meaning a bit more technical. For the purpose of this seminar, I think it's enough to say that in the context of information and computer science, an ontology is a representation of knowledge where each term denotes a certain entity. And these terms may denote classes, relations, and in some cases, individuals. Among these relations, the most important one is the taxonomic relation, which is also called the is-a relation. And this relation relates classes and subclasses, and it's common to any taxonomy. So I'm going to give you a concrete example of an ontology. So this is a portion of an ontology about diabetes diagnosis. So I know that diabetes is quite far from financial products, but I'm giving this example because this ontology is easy to understand and helps me to make some points about ontologies in general. So This ontology presents a bunch of terms which denote things that have something to do with the diabetes diagnosis kind of situation. There are terms as human, patient, symptom, lab test, disease course, and so on. And all these terms are related by relations. So, for example, human is related to object by the is-a relation, meaning that the thing denoted by the term human is a type of object. So human must be considered as a subclass of object. Instead, the thing denoted by the term patient is a type of role, and the role of patient can be carried by humans, and this is made explicit in this ontology by the relation has role. So, of course, in order to establish these relations, it's crucial to know the nature of all these things, and so that one has to be able to provide a definition of all these terms. So an ontology has to provide also definitions. So ontologies are used by humans, but mostly by computer programs, and so they have some practical applications. Ontologies are not just philosophical exercises. So the most obvious application is that ontologies help to better organize data about a certain portion of reality. And the ontology I have just shown, for example, may help organize data about individuals with diabetes. If data are well organized, then it's easier to find them when we need it. In addition, if the data are well organized, then it's also easier to analyze them, and also with the help of algorithms or artificial agents in general. But there is more than that, because ontologies also help share data. And more specifically, ontologies facilitate interoperability, meaning the ability of two or more computer systems to communicate and exchange information. As I said, an ontology can be seen as a description of a portion of reality, and if two computer systems share the same description of reality, or at least a similar one, they are able to understand each other, and so the user of one system can have access to the information collected in another system. So this interoperability can improve our lives significantly. Consider, for example, the case of a doctor who deals with a patient suffering from a very rare disease. It would be crucial for this doctor to have access to the most recent information about all the patients suffering from this disease, for example, and about all the treatments already attempted. Or consider the pandemic we have already just experienced. Any area of the world was affected by the same virus. And at the beginning, no one really knew how to treat people. So it would have been just great to have access to all the data from all the clinics in the world, to know all the treatments, attempts, and the results, and be able to analyze all this data in real time. So, with all this in mind, let's try now to understand why we need an ontology of finance. So the financial world is characterized by an incredible amount of data. So it's not difficult to imagine that an ontology of finance would be very useful in order to organize and analyze all this data. I think it can be interesting to consider some concrete applications of an ontology of finance. So, for example, an ontology could be used by applications which assist people with the identification and tracking of financial goals. An ontology can be a tool used to detect financial frauds or to assess the financial quality of an enterprise by analyzing its financial statements. So, most importantly, since an ontology can facilitate interoperability, then again, that is again the ability of two or more computer systems to communicate and to share data, an ontology of finance would be incredibly useful to assess the systemic risk. Because as you know, systemic risk is the potential collapse of the entire financial system. So this is clearly a very big phenomenon, but still it may be difficult to predict, because in order to provide a reliable assessment of a system, it's necessary to have a big picture that requires in turn a large amount of reliable data, which are difficult to get, especially when we deal with complex products and millions of transactions. So I think that in order to better understand this point, it may be interesting to briefly consider the case of the most recent financial crisis, because of course there are many narratives of the crisis. It's clear that it was a very complex event with different contributory causes. But I think that it's also important to stress that the lack of a proper ontology played its part in this disaster. The lack of a proper ontology was partially responsible for two major problems. On one hand, the problem was that the banks themselves were not able to assess their own risk and to produce reliable reports about themselves. And here, a proper ontology would help collect data and produce better reports. On the other hand, the problem was also that banks were unable to keep track of the financial products they had created. And you know, the securitization process implies many steps and many transactions among banks. But since their computer systems were unable to share information in a proper way, at the end, no one was really able to know where these financial products were. And of course, it would have been crucial to be able to find the toxic assets and remove them from the market to avoid, for example, the panic selling and the disaster. So in this case, again, an ontology would have been very useful, because by promoting interoperability, an ontology would have made it easier to keep track of all these financial products. So in order to improve the safety of the financial world, we need an ontology of finance. And more specifically, we need a reference ontology of finance. A reference ontology represents all the things in a certain portion of reality, and so not just the things useful for a certain purpose. So let's consider now what has been done so far to provide a proper ontology of finance. And I'm trying, I will explain how I'm trying to contribute to this process. So far, there have been two major attempts to build a reference ontology of finance. The first one led to FIBO, which is the ontology hosted, a collection of ontologies hosted by the Enterprise Data Management Council. The second attempt led to OntoFine, which is a work in progress, but still very promising. So both these ontologies has a conceptualist approach. There are different methods to create an ontology. One of these methods is the conceptualist approach. Another one is the realist one. So I don't really want to enter in the debate about conceptualism and realism. For the purpose of this seminar, it's enough to say that in applied ontology, the goal is to create an ontology that is useful, meaning that is able to organize and integrate data. People endorsing the conceptualist approach, the conceptualist view, think that this goal can be achieved simply by representing the world in a way that reflects the way people talk about it. So the conceptualist approach does not consider necessary to make precise metaphysical claims about the nature of things. In contrast, people endorsing the realist approach think that this goal can be better achieved if the ontology is based on precise metaphysical assumptions about the portion of the world we are representing. And that means, for example, to postulate the existence of universals and use some tools from philosophy when we need. So as you can imagine, the realist approach requires more work. It is also time consuming, but on the other hand, it has proven to be incredibly successful, especially in the biomedical field. And so it would be interesting to build an ontology of finance really based to see if the realist approach is successful also when it's used to build ontology representing the social world, so not just the natural world, the natural one. So my goal is to provide a philosophical theory able to account for the financial entities, and this theory would assist in the creation of a realism-based ontology of finance. And so my theory would be realist too. And so let's clarify what I mean with realist theory. So generally speaking, in philosophy, to be realist means to believe that there are things that exist and have qualities regardless of our perceptions, our language, and conceptual schemes. Among these things, there are particles and fields of force, and obviously all the things resulting from the organization of them, such as my desk, you and me, a book, and so on. But then the problem is how one can account for the social world in general and the financial one in particular, since this portion of reality is populated mostly by non-physical entities. Entities such as being a customer, debt, obligation, cannot be observed. And so there is no tool we can use to help to see them. So the problem is to understand how to account for non-physical things in a framework designed to account for physical things. So a possible strategy is to anchor these non-physical entities to something that is instead physical. So, for example, one can anchor the entity being customer to an individual, which is a physical entity. Similarly, one can anchor the entity denoted by the term debt, which is a non-physical entity, to some sort of documents, which instead are physical objects. So I think that this strategy may be useful, but I also think that it's not enough. So I think that it's necessary to do a preliminary work to understand what entities we really need to include in our ontology before trying to figure out how to represent them. So, because I think that from the fact one can anchor non-physical entities to the physical ones, it doesn't follow that one has to necessarily include all these non-physical entities in the ontology. So I think it's crucial to distinguish the cases where the words we use actually denote an entity and cases where instead they don't. And so let's consider transactions so we can see what it means in practice. So in this last section, I'm going to analyze 3 different financial transactions, 3 different cases. But first, I want just to clarify that I'm assuming that a transaction is the fulfillment of a contract to exchange goods, services, and assets for payment. I am also distinguishing bartering transactions from financial transactions where the former doesn't involve money. And I'm going to focus just on financial transactions, so on exchanges involving money. And I consider 3 different financial transactions to see in each case what entities we need to include in our ontology in order to properly account for these processes. So in the first case, money is exchanged against Apple. In the second case, against a piece of land. And finally, in the third case, money is exchanged against some shares of stock or of a stock. So in the first case, there is an apple that is exchanged against money. So one can imagine a situation where I'm buying an apple at the grocery store, where I pay with banknotes and where I interact with a cashier. So in a situation like this one, which is a very ordinary one, the contract between the agents does not take the form of a piece of paper that the agent sign. So in this case, the contract is something more, a bit more implicit. In a grocery store, the price tag of a certain product tells us that the store is willing to give us this product if we give the store a certain amount of money. And when we take the product and we go to check out, we are saying basically that we are accepting this offer. So the contract is completely fulfilled when we give to the store the money and the store gives us the apple. And so the transaction is completed. So this case seems to be pretty simple. Among the entities involved in this case, there are material objects such as human beings, a fruit, some pieces of paper. The human beings carry the role of seller and the role of buyer. The fruit, that is an apple, carries the role of product, and a piece of paper, carries the role of banknote. There is also the information displayed by the price tag that I assume is a sort of abstract pattern. So among the entities involved, there are also some actions. So with the term action, I mean an entity that has temporal parts and that depends on a physical entity, such as human beings. These actions, in this case, include putting the apple on the shelf, adding the price tag, which counts as making an offer, meaning that in this context, to perform these actions means to make an offer. Another action is taking the apple from the shelf, which in turn counts as accepting the offer. And then there are the actions of the agents when they exchange the apple and the banknote that count as completing the transaction. So this case doesn't seem to be too problematic. Let's now consider the second case. That is the case where the good exchanged is a piece of land. So between this case and the previous one, there are at least 3 main differences. First of all, unlike the case of the grocery store, in the case of a piece of land, the offer and the acceptance have a more explicit character, because usually there is a written contract that the agents have to sign. And in this contract, an agent makes clear that if the other agent gives to him a certain amount of money, then he can have this piece of land. When the agents sign the contract, basically they are saying that they are fine with the conditions of the exchange. The second difference is that in the case of a piece of land, after signing the contract, the seller does not really need to do anything more to complete the transaction, because of course a piece of land is not something you can literally give to another person. It's not something you can move to a place to another. And the third difference concerns the payment, because typically when one buys a thing like a piece of land, the payment is made through a bank transfer. But when we make a bank transfer, there is no actual transfer of banknotes. So unlike the case of the grocery store I have just mentioned. So for the buyer to fulfill the contract means to perform some actions such as filling the form for the bank transfer, for example, sign it, and these actions have as a result not the fact again that actually banknotes, physical banknotes, are moved to one place to another, but the fact that something changes about the finances of the people involved. More precisely, I would say that the result is a change in the information about their purchasing power. And of course, a piece of information can be seen as an entity anchored to some sort of financial support, material support. So in this case, the entities to include in the ontology are the human beings. One is the buyer, the others is the seller. I would then include, of course, the piece of land that has the role of product, of God. Then I would include the material supports carrying the relevant pieces of information, like the content of the contract and the content of the form filled by the buyer. And it's important to point out that the piece of information is a different entity from the material support that carries the information. And the reason is that the same piece of information can be carried by different supports. And finally, I would also include the actions performed by the agents, such as signing documents and filling forms. So let's now consider the third case, the case where the transaction involves money and some shares of stock. So this case, in a sense, is similar to the previous one in that we have a written contract where the offer is explicit, and then the payment again is made through a bank transfer. So not with actual physical banknotes. And the main difference between the case of the piece of land and the case of shares or stock is the nature of the things exchanged, because the piece of land is a material object, whereas the stocks are not. So in this case, we have an additional problem to consider. And so the problem here is to understand if the term stock refers to something in reality, meaning if in addition to the content of the contract and the material support carrying, we have to include in our ontology a sort of abstract entity which corresponds to a stock, and it is anchored to some document. So it might be tempting, I think, to say yes, and so to say that the word stock actually denotes a real entity, because stocks seem to be things. They seem to have qualities. So, for example, they have a price, and sometimes we say that this price is characterized by a certain volatility. And so it seems that there is an entity. However, I would be more inclined to try a different solution and consider again the bank transfer. So in this case, I don't think that in order to explain the ontology of a bank transfer, we needed to say that there is an abstract entity that corresponds to the amount of money we are transferring. And so I think that the same strategy can be perhaps applied here to the case of stocks, and trying to account for stocks in terms of information about the finances of the people involved. And so in this case, that is the case of a transaction involving shares of stock, I would say that the entities to include in our ontology are the two human beings. One carries the role of buyer and the other the role of seller. I would then include the material supports carrying the relevant pieces of information, like the content of the contract, and then the content of the form filled by the buyer. And finally, I would also include the actions performed by the agents, such as signing documents and filling forms. But I wouldn't include anything else. And so in general, I think that I would say that financial transactions can be explained by relying on three different types of entities that are material objects, roles, actions, and abstract patterns, which correspond to pieces of information. And these abstract patterns are made concrete by, for example, the ink marks on a piece of paper. And so documents and the information they carry have a crucial role, and we can rely on them to account for a large part of the financial world, without postulating the existence of any other weird abstract entities. And so I don't think that we necessarily need to include in our ontology one entity for each term we use when we talk about the financial world. In the case of stocks, for example, instead of saying that they are a sort of abstract entity anchored to some documents, we can simply try to explain them in terms of pieces of information about the finances of the person holding them. And I think that probably the very same can be said and applied to other terms such as bond, derivatives, and so on. There is, however, more work to do in order to properly develop this view. One should identify the different types of pieces of information, for example, and also specify the relations between these pieces of information and the other entities we have decided to include in our ontology. And so that's it. Any comment, objection, question, everything is very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria, for your talk and the very detailed description on the notion of transaction and also the role of ontology. And yes, and we can now open the debate. And of course, if there are questions, the people can speak directly into the video or raise the hands. And so we are here. And of course, I have questions. And so maybe I can start to break the ice. So my question is the following. If I'm not wrong, the idea is to have a kind of financial ontology to share between all the financial actors.
Mm-hmm.
And so the usefulness of this ontology would be to have control of what's happening in the market.
Yes.
So to prevent or to mitigate the systemic risk or a certain kind of risks.
Yes, exactly.
And so my question is also about, I mean, the cost of this ontology. I mean, of course, that means that each financial actor or institution should have the same ontology in order to have the interoperability, and probably that means a cost for the institution. I don't know if you have some thought about this. Thank you.
Yes. So one problem in applied ontology is to build a good ontology, and the other problem is make sure that the institution organization use it. And as you said, it can be a complicated process because institution organization usually are more willing to make these type of changes where they are motivated, and so when it's useful for them too. So yes, that's a problem too. I mean, it's a part of the process, and one of the steps that we have to take and figure out how to take it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So a quick follow-up before going the floor to other participants. So the idea is that once you have this ontology and you apply them as a kind of superstructure, so you have a way of controlling better what's going in the market real time. That's the idea. So
yeah, it's like if all the data about the financial world are in the same database, so you can just easily and directly have access to this data. And so part of the problem, another problem is also to face possible problems about privacy. And so what data makes sense to make available, what data doesn't make sense to make available, and yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. So now we have a question from Fabian Pregel. So thanks, Fabian, for being here today with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I think definitely you're raising interesting questions about ontology of money and debt and things like that. But maybe just following up on the point just raised. So, like, playing a little bit devil's advocate here, isn't like sort of there seemed to be the suggestion that one of the causes of the financial crisis was a lack of an ontology for CDS and CDOs and whatever. But I mean, surely it wasn't the case that the banks lacked the concept of a buyer or a seller in their ontology. Like surely it was, I mean, the specific quotes presumably refer to things like a lack of central clearing counterparties or reporting obligations, that meaning there was all these bilateral transactions and no one had a clear view kind of what was happening overall. But that doesn't seem to be, I would have thought, a lack of an ontology in any kind of philosophical sense, but rather just a social cooperation issue in the way we've set up financial transactions. I mean, you said just now, I think what would be nice if we had like a central repository or something where everything could be recorded, but which I think is true, and that's kind of, I guess, one of the reactions to the last financial crisis. But I would have thought that's not because we were lacking the ontology to do it before. It was just that for other reasons, no one had thought that was necessary. Is that?
No, for sure. I think that you are right. I mean, I think that we usually discover that we need something when after a huge disaster or after huge problems like the most recent financial crisis. However, I mean, actually, there wasn't a shared ontology. And for example, a concrete example of this is that the contracts they were used, they were created, like the CBOs, for example, didn't have a really sort of identification number that allowed banks to keep track of them. And so on one hand, you are right to say that this is why, because no one really thought that it was necessary. But on the other hand, since now we know that it's necessary and can be very useful to have it, the first step is to build a really working ontology. That is a very complex work, and because the problems I've just raised, they are very simple, but they are also difficult to solve, and so it's very time consuming. And in other fields like the biomedical field, I mean, we know that a very good ontology that is based on metaphysical claims works very well. And so, I mean, I think it's worth it to try to do it also in finance and the social world more in general.
So thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Fabian. We have other questions, a lot of questions I see on the video. So starting from Helen Mussel, is my pronunciation right, I hope? And thanks, Helen.
That's okay. Your pronunciation is excellent. Thank you. And thank you for your talk. So there's a couple of things in here actually which really resonate with a project that I have done, which is looking at the ontology of the fiduciary. And one of the things that came out from that was whether or not there is often a contestation between the fiduciary has an ontology that is an outcome or whether it's processual. And there's something that you said in here about, you know, the next step would be looking at things like, for example, specifying the types of relations. So my question to you, I suppose, here would be, as you said, when you don't have an anchor, when there isn't a clear anchor, and when you do actually have academic and scholarship communities which are furiously debating these things, whether something is processual, whether it's an outcome, what your strategy will be kind of to go about dealing with that. Because I think you're right, when we're not talking about the entity parts of an ontology and we're actually starting to deal more with those connecting pieces, is where it can start to become quite tricky. So I just wanted to ask what your thoughts were on that.
No, I agree that, I mean, it's complicated. and I'm facing the same challenges in the more theoretical work behind this work. So my strategy is actually is more to what I'm trying to do is to analyze the way we use words in ordinary everyday life, especially when we speak about financial entities, to see if what is the state of affair that our words really refer to. And so I think that first of all, I'm trying to see what there is actually, and then after that, I want to see how to represent what there is, and so discuss the relations or the type of entities and so on.
Okay, so consistency and rigor are the big things for you at the moment, looking for the consistency. Yeah, okay. That's helpful. I do have another question, but I'll let somebody else ask first and slip on in the end if I can. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Ellen. Yes, we have other questions, but I hope we have also time to discuss other follow-ups. And we have now the order, I see Giacomo De Colle. So thank you, Giacomo, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Gloria.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. It was great. I really like the idea of like tying everything to information/documentation. That's an interesting approach. I wonder what else you need in certain cases, like for example, you mentioned contracts. It seems that when I do sign a contract, I'm not only changing information, I'm also like gaining a right, for example, or losing a right. So I wonder whether there is at a certain, you think that there will be a need at a certain point to extend this to, for example, law and other concepts coming from, yeah, basically an ontology of law, something like that.
Yes, this is a very interesting question, and of course, is part of the work I'm trying to do, because of course, as you said, when we consider a contract, we also need to consider rights and obligation. And so my idea in this case is to say that, again, the term right doesn't really denote a thing, but more a state of affair. The fact that people with a certain role, for example, people with the role of voter, for example, can vote, and so they are allowed to perform a certain action. So in my understanding is that one can say, okay, there is the content of some documents, for example, the regulation of something that prescribe people having a certain role, a certain course of action. And so again, I would try to explain also this case by considering information.
Okay, thank you. I will, well, I have many follow-ups, but I'll let others go on. Thank you. That helps.
Thank you, Giacomo. And yes, we have now Bo. I see, I mean, the name is B-O on the video.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, I'm Bo Miners, and I work in general ontology and metaphysics. And I have a question about your discussing whether or not stock is an entity included in the ontology. Now, that kind of reasoning is something we use a lot, because following something that's often called Lewis's razor, it's important to a general ontology that there are as few types or kinds or categories of entity as possible. The fewer, the better, the more economical it is. it's great, I think, if that's also important in ontologies of finance. But one question is, why should it be important? Because you're not trying to do a general ontology, you're trying to do something more an applied ontology, something you should be able to use. So the second question is, there's a twist to this with the type, because maybe a type, that entity stock is just a subtype of something you already have included, namely abstract patterns. Now, whether or not subtypes matters compared to types in general, this is a bit complicated. I don't know. Okay. On the other hand, maybe you don't want to worry about types and Lewis's razor, but more about something we might call ideological economy, something relating to simplicity. Do you have few concepts? Is it a simpler theory and stuff? And there I was thinking, wow, this is really what the slide you showed about a part of ontology for diabetes. It's really complicated stuff compared to the hierarchies we have in general ontology and metaphysics. What are your thoughts on this?
So I'm not, of course, I would prefer a simpler explanation than a complex explanation of things, but I think it is common to everyone. Let's say that I'm not want to necessarily include few entities, few concepts, if it doesn't really help to explain how things are. So for me, the priority is actually to explain, to provide a really good explanation of what there is. And so to include entities that really help me to do this. This is the priority. So I'm not, I don't want to support necessarily a extreme parsimony or something like that in this case. And the second, yes, it's true that in applied ontology needed to have useful for a practical, must be useful and help us to achieve our goals. However, as I said, I mean, it seems that if you have a really good metaphysical foundation, then it works better. And especially, what in the last few years, in the last 10, 20 years, actually, it seems that ontologies that are based on a quite clear and strong metaphysical structure are long-lasting. So they last over time. And so this is a very huge advantage, because on one hand, it's true that it's time-consuming to build an ontology like this. But on the other hand, then you don't need to continuously create new ontologies because the previous one fails. And so, I mean, it's a choice, but I mean, I'm studying here in Buffalo, where the approach is more to building ontologies based on a very strong metaphysical, structure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. Now we have two other questions. The first one is Georg Smercek. I hope the pronunciation is right. So thank you, Georg, for being here today with us.
Yes, thank you very much for having me and for the interesting talk. So my question basically departs from the idea that, you can describe the transaction of stocks as an exchange of a stock against money, as you did in your approach. But you could also describe this sort of transaction in different ways that are perhaps more comprehensive. And I would like to describe one of these ways in which potentially you could sort of describe this, what's going on. And I would like to know whether you think that the elements I'll mention sort of are of relevance to your project, to your ontology of the financial transaction. So the description goes as follows. Yeah, we have a seller of a stock who places a limit order on a limit order book market. Then some time passes, and then a buyer places a market order. Then a contract is automatically established on a trading platform, and then it's executed afterwards. Yeah? So this is approximately how financial markets work these days. And I'm wondering, are these things of any relevance to your ontology project? What about limit orders? What about market orders? What about trading venues? What about, you know, a limit order book market or a dealer market? What do you think?
Yes, of course, all these things are very, very relevant. I just provided simpler cases, that is a normal, very standard transaction. And of course, I know that there are things that are many the situation more complex. And but I know I prefer to start with the simpler one, and then I will obviously try to provide a characterization of all the things you are mentioning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you, Gloria. We have the last question of this first round list from Fabrizio Gennaro. So thank you, Fabrizio.
Thank you. Hi, Gloria. Thank you very much. Really interesting and also pretty clear. So thank you very much. Thank you also, Emiliano, for organizing this meeting. I have a similar question regarding the last one. I was wondering, when you talk about the dimension of your analysis of ontology, if I remember well, you mentioned material. So how the transaction is done. For example, if banknotes or between banks. So I was thinking if the technology could be a dimension apart, a dimension that is relevant, standalone. I'm saying that because the actually studying the financial innovation and the financial technology, the technology itself is disrupting all the things, all the transactions, also the models in which the financial transactions are done and also are defined. So with different roles, with different responsibilities, are changing in a systematic way how a financial transaction is done. So I was thinking if this dimension could be considered standalone.
Yeah, I think yes, it's important part then of the work to do. When I was speaking about the bank transfer, for example, the point was that there are this information about the changes in our finances that are in any case recorded, anchored somewhere. And in that case, since there are no real banknotes, we can imagine that there are these pieces of information are anchored to something physical, like hardware, like something of these on these lines. And so yes, what you are saying, obviously it's a part of the work to do, and technology is and all the tools, the technological tools we use in the financial world must be included, obviously, in an ontology of this type.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gloria.
Thank you.
I don't know if you have time for other questions or...
Yes, I have time.
Okay, also if there are other questions, please raise your hands and we can have another round in case. Otherwise, I mean, you can stop. You have another question from Fabrizio. I see Fabrizio.
Yes, just a simple one. I was working on a taxonomy of the financial technology, so the so-called fintech, and doing the I was doing the study and this research is a lot of working also in the definition of a single fintech services, but also in the relation and within all the system. I was wondering how the definition of the taxonomy is related to the ontology that you are talking about, because the taxonomy is a part of the study of ontology, at least as you mentioned before. I just want to understand better this relation between taxonomy and ontology.
Yeah, so in a taxonomy, basically the classes are connected by the relation is A. So we connect classes and subclasses, whereas in ontology, an ontology includes these, but there are also other type of relation. For example, in the ontology about the diabetes, there was the relation has role, or the relation, I don't remember, participate in a certain process. And so an ontology provides more other types of relations that can help to explain more in detail what's going on in reality.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I don't know if there are other questions. Yeah, I don't see. I mean, yeah, there is Helen Marcel. So thank you, Helen.
I've been trying to remember what my second question was, and I kind of remembered it now. It actually ties up into this idea of ontology and risk. So as you put forward, one of your explanations for developing this would be to reduce systemic risk, potentially. So I suppose I want to play devil's advocate and say to what extent this sort of kind of level of interoperability, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, but to what extent would that level of interoperability kind of increase commercial risk? So for example, then you have a very shared platform of information to some extent. And I just want to play devil's advocate and just say, you're kind of moving towards one direction away from another, and you are talking about the world of banking and finance. So I'm just really interested to know how you're going to kind of weigh that out, as it were.
Yeah, let's say that part of the problem is to understand what data makes sense to share. And so, of course, one should also consider pros and cons, benefits, and possible harms. And I mean, it's a very complicated thing to assess, I think. But I mean, at least I'm more concerned to work on this ontology. So the point is, okay, I will create this ontology. I will do my best, and then someone else should consider pros and cons and what data makes sense to share, what data is better to not share, and yes, but all these are obviously very interesting problems. There are some ethical issues also concerning interoperability and data integration and shared data.
Yeah, I'm thinking here about when we had the situation with the 2008 crash, and ultimately the inability to be able to identify some of the products, etc. So I'm just trying to think how your system here would move away from that, but also at the same time how the complexity that was built into the system to some extent had created the profit going forward. So yes, yeah. So I suppose where I'm getting at here is the opaqueness in it sometimes can be the piece that gives the competitive edge, whereas the clarity might be seen as being risky in the other direction. So yeah, I just wanted to play devil's advocate and ask you about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think that we can thank again Gloria. Thank you, Gloria. That's a very fascinating project, and I mean, I think that you also have a kind of market for this.
Hopefully.
And, yeah, and so good luck with it, and thanks again for being with us today, and I hope to see you soon again here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all.
And thank you everybody for being here today with the Gloria and this meeting on the Phinance Online Seminar, and hope to see you soon probably next month. And goodbye, good evening.
Bye, bye-bye. Thank you.